He was a man who was impossible to ignore, a flamboyant character with a cigar and a $50,000 pinky ring. Although he weighed over 250 pounds, he could, when the occasion demanded it, move with lethal speed and force. His jowly smile contrasted with the two scars that streaked across his left cheek. Then there was his clothing. His wardrobe was nothing short of outrageous. Custom-tailored purple suits, pearl grey fedoras, and diamond-encrusted stick pins. He loved attention, wanting people to adore him even as he ruthlessly dispatched those who he had no use for. His name was Al Capone, and he has become the symbol of American greed and corruption in the 1920s and 30s. When he died on January the 25th, 1947, the New York Times called him a monstrous symbol of a disease which was eating into the conscience of America. But the paper went on to say, Capone was incredible, the creation of an evil dream, yet almost everything that the public thought they knew about him, and that most of us think we know today, is false, the product of decades of glorification and myth-making. And in today's Biographics video, we're going to peel back the layers to discover the real Al Capone. Gabrielle and Teresa Capone made the big move from Sicily to New York in 1894. They ended up in a 4-room flat on Park Avenue, adjacent to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The couple had 2 sons in tow, the youngest who was just a few months old. A third boy followed shortly after their arrival. A barber by trade, Gabrielle was looking for a new life in America. What he found was a city in which immigrants were viewed as lower citizens. Italians especially were vilified by Americans who blamed the spiraling crime rate that New York was experiencing on them. Yet the Capones, they were a hard-working family. They were law-abiding and trying to fit into their new society. When their 4th son, Alphonse, was born in 1899, the family had settled into a decent but hard existence. Life around the Brooklyn Naval Yard, it was pretty rough and tumble, and by the age of 10, young Al Capone had begun to exhibit the toughness and brashness that he carried into his adult life. From the start, Al emerged as a natural leader. At the age of 14, he formed the Navy Street Gang in order to protect Italian women from harassment from their Irish neighbors. By now, he had been expelled from school for punching a female teacher in the face, but you know what he said? Well, she hit him first. Just prior to World War I, the Capones, they moved out of the Italian ghetto. Gabrielle's head down and get on with it attitude was paying off, and Al found himself in an upwardly mobile middle-class community. Still further up the hill, though, was where the really well-off people lived. This area, it was strictly off-limits to the likes of the Capones. The teenage Al looked upon this area with envious eyes. This was where the Rockefellers lived, and the feisty teen saw no reason why he couldn't live the Rockefeller way. He just had to find a means of getting there. By the age of 19, Al had become a local tough who knew how to use a gun and a knife. He was a big, brutish brawler who could knock a man to the ground with a single punch. He'd also found himself a family. On December the 30th, 1918, he married May Coughlin, who was 2 years older than him. 3 weeks previously, May had given birth to their son, Albert. Family life, it encouraged Capone to get on the straight and narrow. Intent on turning to a respectable life worthy of his wife and child, he moved the family out of the neighborhood and away from the bad influences. They shifted to Baltimore, and Al took a job as a bookkeeper. Ironically, this straight job would come in handy down the track when he was juggling millions of dollars earned from bootleg liquor. Now, that could have been the end of the story for Alphonse and May Capone. They could have settled into an uneventful life of respectability in Baltimore, maybe even work their way up the social ladder to gain some community status. But, well, as we well know, that wasn't to be. With the sudden death of his father of a heart attack, Al's flirtation with respectability, well, it was over. He returned for the funeral and soon found that the family were now looking to him for guidance as well as financial support. That would require more money than he was earning as a bookkeeper in Baltimore. Meanwhile, the local gang that Al had pulled away from, an outgrowth of the Manhattan-based 5 Points gang, they were at a crossroads. 6 months earlier, a mafia bigwig in Chicago named Big Jim Colosimo had been shot dead. The leader of the gang that Capone had pulled away from, Johnny Torrio, was intent on stepping into the vacuum vacuum created by Big Jim's demise. He invited Capone to join him as his right-hand man. Torrio had been grooming Capone for the last couple of years. He'd given him a job as a collector to ensure extortion payments were made. He soon graduated to become the main bouncer and bartender at the Harvard Inn on Coney Island. Now, it was one night at this establishment that Al told a female patron that she had a nice rear end. The girl's brother, well, she didn't take so kindly to the remark, and in an instant had carved up Capone's face with a bottle opener. For the rest of his life, Al would carry dual stripes down his cheek, giving rise to the name Scarface. Now, while he'd been in Baltimore, rumors had circulated that Al had been involved in a couple of murders. One prostitute who was suspected of withholding pimp money, and the other was a friend who'd reneged on a gambling debt. All of this was bringing unwanted police attention to the gang, and shortly after his father's funeral, Capone was called to a meeting with Lucky Luciano, a key member of the gang. "So, what's going on?" Al is reported to have asked, nervously. "I'll tell you what's going on," Luciano replied. "You gotta get the hell out of town and don't bother to pack." Luciano, he then handed Al an envelope which contained $2,000, which is about $25,000 in today's money, and directed him to go straight to Grand Central Station and head for Chicago. Al arrived in Chicago in 1921, ready, willing, and eager to learn the ropes. He left his wife and baby behind in Brooklyn with instructions to follow once they'd established their new life. The challenge now for Johnny Torrio, the leader of the gang, was to get Al Capone to stop using his fists and start using his brains in order to succeed in the rackets. He put Capone in the position of head bouncer and bartender at the Four Deuces, a 4-story building which served as Torrio's general offices, which also housed a saloon and a cafe. The top floor of this establishment, well, that was a brothel, and Al apparently spent quite a lot of time on that floor where he wasn't exactly working. Indeed, his sexual proclivities resulted in a lifelong battle with syphilis. It was no place for the weak of heart. Countless unsolved murders took place there, with Al playing a leading hand in dispatching those who Torrio wanted eliminated. In fact, Al did so well within the year that he was made a partner, sharing in the $100,000 annual profits. Now, Torrio taught Capone how to portray an air of respectability, even as he delved deeper and deeper into the underworld. As a cover, Al opened a second-hand furniture store next door. He carried business cards announcing his occupation as furniture dealer. As Chicago authorities began to crack down on organized crime, Torrio spread his business interests into the suburbs. In the suburbs, local police and politicians, well, they could be controlled more easily. In fact, it was Torrio's expansion beyond Chicago that was the key to the development of the empire that Capone would eventually inherit. By the time Capone arrived in the Windy City, Torrio had already set up vice, gambling, and prostitution operations in the nearby town of Burnham. Then, with the election of crime-busting Chicago Mayor William E. Devine in October of 1923, the entire base of the operation was moved to the western suburb of Cicero. The plan was to make Cicero a wide-open town where the gang could peddle booze and accommodate gamblers at will. To do so, Torrio, he reached an agreement with the authorities to shut down his brothels in Cicero so long as he had free rein on the other two arms of his business. By cutting the police and politicians in on the profits, Johnny soon developed the operation he wanted. Within 6 months of moving in, the outfit owned the town of Cicero lock, stock, and barrel. By January of 1924, Torrio felt so confident in his position that he embarked on a trip back to the old country where he planned to set his mother up in a fine home in Venice. In his absence, Al would be in charge. Al's first challenge was to make sure that the officials who had his back, well, that they stayed in office. The local elections were to be held in April, and Capone was prepared to go to any lengths to keep the incumbents in office. Well, what's the way Al Capone would do this? Well, that would be by bringing some extra muscle. He brought his two older brothers, Ralph and Frank, over from New York. The brothers thought nothing of destroying ballots and replacing them with votes for their own candidates. Everyone kind of just went along with whatever the Capones did. The police, the sheriff, even the state's attorney. they all went along with it, apparently deciding that it was futile to try and depose them. On the day of the election in Cicero, Torrio Capone gangsters used guns and fists to intimidate voters, escorting them to the ballot box and watching them drop their votes for the incumbent mayor directly into the box. Honest poll watchers and election officials were held captive until after the ballot closed. Honest citizens, well, obviously they were outraged at this. Some of them even called upon Chicago Judge Edmund D. Jarecki to do something about the Cicero gang. Jarecki deputized 70 Chicago cops who went into Cicero in plain clothes and unmarked black sedans. They soon spotted Frank Capone on the street, gunning him down and then riddling his body with bullets. When Al heard about his brother's slaying, all of the sophistication that Torrio had imbued him over the last year was ripped away. His savage nature was unleashed as he vowed to take revenge. It took all of Torrio's persuasive skill to keep him in check. But Torrio, he was not able to keep Capone out of the spotlight. Staying in the background had, in Al's mind, cost the life of his brother. Torrio, he continued to preach non-violence, only resorting to brute force when all else failed. But the name of Al Capone, well, that was synonymous with violence. This is something that's pretty well illustrated in contemporary culture. We've got a clip here thanks to Boardwalk Empire. Pretty nicely sums up how we see Al Capone. Now, try as he might to follow his leader's advice, Capone was plagued by mayhem and a temper that he found difficult to control. Al's base nature was combative rather than diplomatic, and it resulted in an awful lot of bloodshed in the years that were to come. Al's pent-up emotions over the death of his brother Frank were given expression on the evening of May 8, 1924. His partner in a prostitution ring, Jack Guzik, had been roughed up by an Irish thug named Joe Howard for refusing him a loan. Capone immediately tracked down Howard in a bar and demanded to know what had happened. Howard took one look at Capone, called him a Dago pimp, and then told him to get lost. At this point, Capone pulled out his pistol and shot Howard in the face. And he did this in front of dozens of witnesses. The law, it never convicted Al for this brazen murder, but the press, they certainly did. The original story identified him as Al Brown, but when it was picked up by other papers, it was corrected to Alphonse Capone. This was really the beginning of his public persona, and when he became famous for it. Less than a year later, in January of 1925, Johnny Torrio was ambushed by rival gang members. He came within an inch of losing his life, surviving only to have a 9-month prison term slapped on him for operating an illegal brewery. While inside, he decided that he'd had enough of the Chicago madness. By the end of that year, he'd completely handed the reins over to Capone, and he disappeared. Capone, he inherited a gold mine from Johnny Torrio that was fueled by a highly organized operation that operated largely behind the scenes. In fact, the duplicity was so complete that 99% of the citizens of Cicero never even saw a gangster. Rather, the mob used the government to control the area, with non-compliant merchants being plagued with higher taxes and loss of parking in front of their stores. Well, they quickly got the message, and they got into line. Now Capone set his sights on the north side of Chicago. To make some headway, he first had to subjugate the deadliest gang Chicago had ever known, the Jenners. They operated in the open, even having police protection. The Jenners also had been major suppliers of alcohol to the Torrio Capone outfit, and Capone had even supported them in their battles with other gangs. But after crushing the rival O'Banian gang, the Jenners decided to take over the Capone empire. It would prove to be their undoing. The Jenners selected a couple of Sicilians to assassinate Capone. However, recognizing Capone's power and fearful that such an attempt would lead to their own demise, the Sicilian duo informed Capone of the Jenners' intentions. Al convinced them to turn on the Jenners, and in short order they had killed 3 of the Jenner brothers. The remaining 3 brothers, well, they fled to Sicily. With the Jenners, well, they were out of the way. Capone now had to deal with the survivors of the O'Banian gang, who had raided Capone's headquarters a number of times. On one particular occasion, they had used 8 touring cars. They first shot blanks to lure people outside, and then followed with live ammunition, hoping to kill Capone on the spot. The ruse, well, it didn't work. Though over 1,000 rounds were fired, miraculously, no one was killed. Al was convinced that the brains behind this attempted hit was Jaime Weiss, leader of the O'Banian gang, and he immediately ordered the death of this man. The hitmen set themselves up across from Weiss's flower shop and waited. And waited and waited. After a week, they finally spotted Weiss walking towards his shop. They killed him and 3 of his bodyguards successfully. Stepping into the vacuum created by the killing of Jaime Weiss was Bugs Moran, who was as eager to get rid of Capone as Weiss had been. Moran had plenty of guts, but little common sense. He publicly denounced Capone, especially for peddling bad women and bad alcohol. Constantly on the attack, Moran's troops launched a number of forays against Capone's businesses. By February of 1929, Capone had had enough. He ordered a massive hit on Capone to take place on St. Valentine's Day. The killers, disguised as policemen, entered Moran's warehouse and caught the 7 victims off guard. Facing them towards the wall as if they were going to frisk them, they then mowed them down with machine gun fire. Moran was not among them, but this attack, well, it was enough to scare him off. Having eliminated all opposition on the north side of Chicago, Capone now focused on the south. After a number of killings, his rivals, well, they sued for peace, agreeing to give Al a large slice of their operation. By March of 1929, Al Capone, he was the undisputed king of Chicago, being portrayed to the public as the ultimate gangster. Yet at the same time, he was being read the Riot Act by his peers. For years, the leaders of organized crime had been holding annual meetings to discuss matters of mutual concern. Now the matter of mutual concern, well, it was what to do with Al Capone. Al had attracted a tremendous amount of unwanted attention with the St. Valentine's Day massacre. He was bringing too much unwanted attention as the king, and, well, the time had come for him to be neutralized. The commission decreed that Joseph Aleo, an old enemy of Capone, would be put in place in Chicago to keep Al in check. Capone would also have to cede his gambling operations to the commission. Capone was privately outraged that the commission was muzzling him in this way, but he was also smart enough to know that if he protested, he would quickly be eliminated. He decided to take the advice of the commission and lie low for a while, and what better way to safely lie low than from inside a jail cell? Within 16 hours of coming out of the commission meeting, Capone had been arrested for carrying a concealed weapon. Capone entrusted his $50,000 diamond pinky ring to his attorney with instructions to give it to his brother Ralph, who would become acting head until he returned. He then began a 12-month jail term. When he emerged from his prison cell in March of 1930, Capone discovered that the climate had changed. He had been listed as public enemy #1 by the FBI. The federal government now considered him a menace to society and was prepared to do anything to put him behind bars for good. It was certain that Al was violating the Volstead Act by selling liquor, but they were unable to prove it. Not even Elliot Ness and his untouchables were able to stop Capone. Finally, the FBI decided that their best chance of putting Capone away was to convict him of tax evasion. Capone was used to being cheered when he attended public events, but now that the government was bringing income tax evasion charges against him, crowds, they started booing him. What's worse, his formerly fail-proof methods of fixing the outcomes of trials, they were having no effect. Al did manage to bribe several jury members, but on the day of the trial, the judge switched the jury panel. From that moment on, the jurors were sequestered, and they were out of Al's reach. After presenting a damning case which highlighted a life of lavish spending yet virtually no tax payments, the prosecution concluded by reminding the jury that Capone was no Robin Hood. He spent wildly on himself and his cronies, doing nothing to help the poor and the down and out. The judge found him guilty on 3 counts of tax evasion, and on October 24th, 1931, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison. This was the harshest sentence ever handed down for tax evasion. Capone, well, he thought that now his gangland associates would rally to his aid, but he just didn't get it. Maybe his advancing syphilis had something to do with it, but the reality was that he had been artfully shunted aside at the Atlantic City meeting in 1929. Now, 2 years later, his life was out in the open for all to see, and he had a felony conviction to his name. He was anathema to his former gangland buddies. They ignored him. Capone spent most of his time in an Atlanta prison and then spent the last 3 years of his sentence at Alcatraz. By then, his syphilis had seriously eroded his mental faculties. By the time he died of cardiac arrest on January 25th, 1947, doctors concluded that he had the mind of a 12-year-old child. And well, that was all for Al Capone. Now, we'd love to know what you think of this video. Please leave us a comment below, and if you did like it, why not subscribe or share this video with a friend? We're going to be publishing 2 videos a week just like this, and also please do leave a like if you liked it, and as always, thanks for watching.